Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving Storm Byron to be here this morning. And I was asked to mention that all of the shiurim today, this Chanukah Yom Yun, is sponsored by Amy and Ephraim Bassan, in memory of Amy's father, Avram ben David Tzvi, whose yortzeit was this week on Yudchet Kislev. Okay, we're talking today about Chanukah. Inside or outside? So first of all, what I will not be discussing in the shir is the halachot of where you should light your Chanukah candles. Somebody advertised during the week, Rabbi Kenigsberg will be speaking about where you should light your candles. That is incorrect. So if you want to know where to light your candles, there's lots of literature and many shirim that are available, but today we're not talking halacha, we're talking hashkafa. We'll use halacha to help us understand the points as well. But what I want to discuss really, there are two principles, probably the two most well-known principles when it comes to Chanukah, which actually, if you stop to think about for just a moment, you'll see that these principles contradict each other entirely. On the one hand, right, when we think about Chanukah, we think about the candles, we think about what is really the foundation of the mitzvah of lighting the candles of Chanukah. So the Gemara tells us, you see your source sheets you have in front of you, source number 1, the Gemara Masechet Shabbat says, Tanu Rabbanan, mitzvat Chanukah, Nel ish ubeito. Okay, Nel ish ubeito, which means the mitzvah of Chanukah relates to the candle of a person and his house, or his home, or his household. Lots to say, to dissect about those three words. And then the Gemara goes on, talks about Mahadrin, min Mahadrin, right? Nobody today fulfills the mitzvah on the basic level of Ner ish ubeito. Everybody goes Mahadrin min Mahadrin, depending how we understand that. But the point is, the way the mitzvah is defined is very, very unusual. Very, very unusual. Normally speaking, we have a mitzvah and we would say, take the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, take the mitzvah of Lulav, of Shofar, any mitzvah you can think of. So the way that it's phrased by the poskim, you open up the Rambam, you open up many of the classical Sfarim, and they'll say, every person is obligated in this mitzvah. Right? The Gemara never says, and in fact, the Rambam himself never says that every person is obligated in the mitzvah of Chanukah, but it says, Ner ish ubeito. It's related to the home. It's related to the house. Okay, the Rambam, when he begins to formulate Hilchot Chanukah, the way he writes it, he says, how many candles does a person have to light? And then he says, mitzvah she'kol bayit v'bayit madlik ner echad. Every home needs to light a candle. How does a home light a candle? Obviously the people in the home. But here it's a mitzvah not incumbent on the individual, but it's a mitzvah that's incumbent on the household. Okay, and again, there's lots to talk about, and there are many nafkaminot that come out of this. For example, if somebody who is not himself obligated in mitzvot, if you have a katan, right, a young child who's reached the age of chinuch, can he light the candles on behalf of the household? He himself would not be obligated in mitzvot, but maybe as part of the household he can. That's an interesting halachic discussion that exists. But the point is, we see it's related to the household, but more than that, it's related to the home. The physical space of where one lights one's Chanukah candles is in the home. Okay? And we'll see how far this goes. Just before we get into further, I'll give you a spoiler. What's the second concept? What's the second principle, which really seems to contradict this idea of Ner ish ubeito? And that is a concept that comes up everywhere in Hilchot Chanukah. It's the most common word you'll hear said in relation to Chanukah, and that is Pirsumei Nisa. Right? Pirsumei Nes, publicizing the miracle. And what I want to argue is that these two principles stand in complete contradiction to one another. That will be the first half of the shir. And the second half of the shir we'll have to try and understand and try and resolve how they actually can live together and what the message is and what that teaches us. But let's focus for now on Ner ish ubeito. Okay, so we see this many different places. So as we've said, first of all, we have the Gemara in Shabbat that tells us the basic mitzvah of Chanukah relates to the household, relates to the home, relates to the house. The most obvious expression of that is, where do I light my Chanukah candles? I light them outside or inside. Okay, there's a historical development as to how that works, but we light them outside the home or inside the home. But what happens if a person finds himself in a place where there is no home? Is there still a mitzvah of Chanukah candles? Right? And just to explain how strange and how unique this is, let's take another mitzvah just as an example. A mitzvah of shofar. A person is obligated on Rosh Hashanah to hear the shofar. I don't care whether you're at home or whether you're in shul or wherever you are. Generally speaking, we hear the shofar. We come to shul and we hear the shofar. Somebody is not able to come to shul, so somebody goes to their house and blows the shofar for them there. You blow the shofar in the hospital. You blow the shofar on the street, wherever it is. But it's the obligation of the individual. I don't care where you are. So we might have thought that Chanukah should be the same. We might have thought that by Chanukah you'll say every individual, why do we light candles? Because we know in the times of Chanukah, of the Chashmonaim, they came to the Beit HaMikdash and they rededicated. There was only enough oil for one day. The oil lasted for 8 days. Okay. By the way, I have to mention, we can't give a share on Chanukah without mentioning the question of the Beit Yosef, right? The most famous question of Chanukah, which is, the Beit Yosef asks, he says there was enough oil to last for 1 day, and the oil lasted for 8 days. Therefore, the miracle was for how many days? 7 days. So therefore, we all light Chanukah candles for 7 days, right? Light for 8 days. So why? That's the question of the Beit Yosef, and everybody has a different answer for that. There is a book that was written called Ner Lemea, which has 100 different answers to this question. Then there's another book, which I'm not sure what it's called, but it has 500 answers to this question, and legend has it that there's a book currently being written with 1,000 answers to the question. Okay, so that's, maybe we'll come back to, maybe we'll give one answer. One answer is enough. You know, when you have 500 answers to 500 different answers to a question, that's usually an indication that none of the answers are very good. But if we can find one answer that's good enough, we won't need all other 499. So we'll come back to that at the end. In any event, we digress. So we're talking about the fact that you have to light the candles as a remembrance of what happened, a remembrance of the miracle. Okay, so what difference should it be where you are? So therefore we might say every individual is obligated to light a Chanukah candle. If you're at home, light them at home. If you're in shul, light them in shul. If you're at the Chabad's party in the town square, light them in the town square, right? But that's not what we say. The Gemara says, Ner Ishu Beito. Have a look in source number 2, Gemara and Shabbat. Also, this is dealing with the sugyas of Chanukah. And here we find something very, very unique, again, when it comes to the mitzvah of Chanukah candles, as follows. Says the Gemara, source number 2, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav, Hamadlik ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarech. Okay, someone who is fulfilling the mitzvah of Chanukah has to say the bracha when I light the candles. Okay, how many brachot? We know there are 2 brachot. The first night there are 3 brachot because of Shechianu. Okay. V'Rav Yirmiyahu Amar, Haro'eh ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarech. So the first opinion in the Gemara said that one who lights the candle says the bracha. And now comes Rav Yirmiyahu and says, actually, I'll tell you something else. Somebody who sees a Chanukah candle says a bracha. This is what's called Birkat HaRo'eh. Again, I'm not getting into now the technicalities and practical halacha in terms of when and how one would actually say this bracha. It's quite limited. But says Rav Yirmiyahu, there is a concept of somebody, for whatever reason, maybe he hasn't lit the candles at home, maybe he didn't see, okay, but when he sees another candle that's lit, he can say the bracha. Now this is very strange. We don't say that somebody who sees somebody else holding a lulav says a bracha. Why, if I see a Chanukah candle, would I even have havamina? Why would I even think that you would say a bracha? So have a look at Tosfot, right? Tosfot here, and Tosfot actually makes this comment in Masechet Sukkah, but he's discussing this concept. He says as follows: Haro'eh ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarech. Bishar mitzvot kegon halulav v'sukkah lo tzakinu levarech laro'eh. This is what we don't find this by other mitzvot. You see somebody else with a lulav, you see somebody else sitting in a sukkah, you don't say the bracha. Ela gabei ner Chanukah. This is something unique to ner Chanukah. And why is that? So he gives 2 reasons. Number 1, he says, Mishum chavivut hanes. Okay, this is also something which is remarkable. We find throughout Hilchot Chanukah this concept of chavivut, this concept, the idea that the mitzvah is precious, that it is beloved. Of course, all the mitzvot are precious. All the mitzvot are beloved. Why? By Ner Chanukah, there's something special. The Rambam as well, he writes, Mitzvat Ner Chanukah mitzvah chavivahi ad me'od. The Rambam writes that the Chanukah mitzvah, the candle, is an exceedingly beloved, exceedingly precious mitzvah. Remember, my Rosh Hashiva used to say, right, the Rambam doesn't, he said, Ulo m'chalek tzionim lemitzvot. He doesn't allocate points to what's the greatest mitzvah and what's less. Why? By Chanukah, all of a sudden, he says mitzvah chaviva ad me'od. For whatever reason, so says Tosfot, there is a special something precious about this mitzvah, and therefore we have this additional bracha. Okay, but that's not enough. That's not a good enough answer. So he continues. He says, "V'gam mishum sheyesh kama bnei adam she'en lahem batim ve'en be'adam lekayem hamitzvah." He says there are people who don't have a home, and therefore they cannot fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, let's just clarify one thing here, because people always ask this, and a lot of people are traveling during Chanukah. So a person's in a hotel or a person's somewhere that's not their regular home, and they say, am I still obligated in the mitzvah of Chanukah? And the answer is yes. Wherever, if you're in a hotel or you're staying somewhere else, right, the place where you are sleeping that night, that's considered your home. It's a home for the purposes of the mitzvah of Chanukah. But let's imagine you might have, for example, a soldier who's out in the field, who's sleeping in a tent, or worse, is just sleeping out in open air. That is not a home by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, and there are other scenarios that we can think of as well. Somebody who's flying on overnight air travel, right? The plane is not really considered a home. Or kipshuto, right? The simple, plain understanding, lo aleinu, but sometimes there are people that are homeless. So says Tosfot, there are people who don't have a home, and therefore, if one does not have a home, one would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, because of the chavivut hanesh, because it's so precious, and Chachamim didn't want anybody to lose out entirely on the mitzvah of Chanukah, they said, all right, you don't have a home, you can't light the candles, you can't fulfill the mitzvah in that way, but you can at least say the bracha birkat haroeh. Now, all of this just raises the questions, it exacerbates the point. So they don't have a home. So why can't they just light the candles where they are? Why does it have to be that it's related specifically to a house? But that emerges very, very clearly from Tosfot that a house is a necessary precondition of fulfilling this mitzvah. Rashi as well, Rashi on our Gemara, just before he explains, who is haroeh? You're walking through the marketplace and you see in one of the courtyards, you see the lights that are lit. מצאתי בשם רבנו יצחק בן יהודה, שאמר משם רבנו יעקב, דלא אזקקה בחזו אלא למי שלא הדליק בביתו עדיין, או ליושב בספינה. He says this bracha of haroeh, somebody who hasn't lit at home, or somebody who is on a boat. Somebody who's on a boat that is not considered a home. Says Rashi, seemingly the same as Tosfot. Somebody who doesn't have a home for the night of Chanukah would therefore not be able to light. Right? There is a lot of discussion amongst the Achronim and the later authorities regarding this Rashi, Leoshev Besfina, exactly what he's talking about. And many say that Rashi means to say somebody who's on a boat that doesn't have his own separate private cabin. If you're on a cruise ship and you have your own room, whatever it is, that could be considered a home as well. But in any event, be that as it may. So that's the second source that we see that says to us, indicates very, very strongly that if there is no home, there is no mitzvah. A third place where we see this, the third indication, if you skip for a moment to source number 4, which is the Beit Yosef. The Beit Yosef here in this siman is discussing the minhag that we have to light Chanukah candles in shul. Lighting Chanukah candles in shul is very interesting. It's a case of a minhag that everybody does, and everybody accepts that we do, and everybody just about accepts that we should do, and nobody really knows why. Right? It's not clear exactly when this minhag began, and it's gone through a few different formulations. But nowadays it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch, and everybody lights Chanukah candles in shul. This is universal. But if you say, why do we light Chanukah candles in shul? And what is the source of the minhag? And what is the reason? There are many explanations given. And as I said earlier on, when you have to have many different explanations for something, that's usually a sign that not one of them is completely satisfactory. So the Beit Yosef brings a number of answers, a number of explanations why it is that we light the Chanukah candles in shul. And he says here in source number 4, Mash Kadav, Shemenichin Chanukah bebeit HaKnesset. Okay, the Torah says the Beit Yosef is Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. This is his commentary, his explanation on the Torah, right? And then afterwards, the Shulchan Aruch is the summary of the Beit Yosef. In fact, you may know that Rabbi Yosef Karo writes in his introduction to the Shulchan Aruch, Right? He says the Shulchan Aruch was written. That's just a Sefer Kitzur. That's just to help you remember. If you really want to understand halacha, you have to learn the Beit Yosef. But why did I write the Shulchan Aruch? He says that's so that every 30 days you could review it. He expects that every 30 days we'll read through and remember the entire Shulchan Aruch. Okay. Nir'eh shetiknu. Says the Beit Yosef, why do we light the candles in shul? Nir'eh shetiknu ken mipnei ha'orchim. This is because of the guests. She'en lahem bayit ladlik bo. People that are traveling through, who don't have a home, they're away from home, and they don't have anywhere to go to light at home. It's for their benefit that we light the candles in shul. So he says it's similar to kiddush. Kiddush we find in the Gemara, Masechet Pesachim, tells us why do we make kiddush in the shul on Friday night. But in Eretz Yisrael, this is not so common anymore. But in Chutz La'aretz, it's still very common. Many places you go, but on Shabbat, they'll make Kiddush in shul on Friday night. But we have a principle that says, "En Kiddush ela b'makom seudah." Right? When we have a Kiddush on Shabbat morning in the shul, so we make sure there's a seudah, we've got the cholent, we've got the kugel, we've got everything, right? But Friday night, you just say the Kiddush in shul. There's no seudah, no one's eating there. Why? How can you fulfill the obligation of Kiddush? How is it not a bracha levatala? Asks the Gemara. So the Gemara explains, no, the reason is because the shul, in days of yore, was not just a shul, but that was also the place. There would be a room adjacent to the shul, and people that were passing through need a place to stay for Shabbat, need a place to stay overnight. They would sit in the shul, and they would sleep there, and they would eat there, etc. And therefore, so those places that still do it nowadays, that's a remnant of that minhag that existed. But so suggests the Beit Yosef. Now, regarding Kiddush, the Gemara says that explicitly. It says that's why we make Kiddush in the shul. It doesn't, in fact, the Gemara doesn't say that we light Chanukah candles in the shul, but he says it's the same reason. Just as there were people who stayed there, so it was their home, that's where they would make Kiddush, there would have been people that were staying in the shul, and that would have been their home, so therefore you would have lit the Chanukah candles. Nowadays, no one's sleeping there. Okay, once we have the minhag, so we continue the minhag. But have a look at the last line in source number 4. It's quoting from the Rivash, which we'll see a little bit later. It says, "Mikom makom be'ota adlaka shel Beit HaKnesset ein adam yotzei ba." Nonetheless, the way that we do it nowadays, whoever lights the candles in shul, okay, they've not fulfilled their obligation. They've not fulfilled the mitzvah. And everybody needs to go home and needs to light candles again. So even the person, if it's the gabbai or the chazan or whoever's been nominated to say the bracha and light the candles in shul, they can go home and they can say the bracha again and they can light the candles at home. You'll ask me, so then how can they say the bracha in shul? Why is that not a bracha levatala? And that gets into the sugya of we have a minhag. Well, we can say, we hold that we can, certainly Ashkenazim, we say that we can say a bracha on a minhag. For example, when we say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, so we say bracha. Sfaradim don't say a bracha when they say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, because that's a minhag, and therefore they would not, they are concerned for that bracha levatala. Okay, but what the point is, what we see from here, this is our third source, that says, the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, the only way that I can fulfill the mitzvah is if I light the candles outside, adjacent to my house, to my home. If I'm not in a home, that is not the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Okay, we have one example, we have one strong minhag of lighting in a shul, which is not a home, but according to this, the only reason that minhag started was because it was a home for some people, and therefore we light it. So that is principle number 1. Now Isha Beito, the principle of the home. The Chanukah candles are related, are connected intrinsically to the house, to the home, which is also known in Chazal as Reshut HaYachid, which is the private domain, which is the place that is not public. It's the place that the most private that can be. And therefore I say, and I argue, that the second principle, which we're about to discuss, is a complete contradiction to this, and that is the principle of Pirsumei Nisa. The mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is all about publicizing the miracle. It's all about making it the most public that can be. So if it's all about making it public, why did Chazal establish it in the place that is the most private? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. So let's think about this for a moment. Let's think about where we see and how we know and how important Pirsumei Nisa is. And you'll see that this is something which dictates every single element of the lighting of Chanukah candles. It dictates how many we light, it dictates where we light, it dictates when we light, it's everything. Pirsumei Nisa. So, for example, look on the other side of the page for a moment. You have source number 6, which is the Rambam. The Rambam in Ilchot Megillah v'Chanukah. Right, the Rambam puts the two festivals that we have, the Rabbanan of Purim and Chanukah, he puts them together, right, in the same section of Halachot. So here in chapter 4, where he's talking about Chanukah, he says the following: Mitzvat ner Chanukah, mitzvah chavivahi ad meod. It's the language I quoted earlier, right? This is an exceedingly precious, beloved mitzvah. V'tzarich adam lehizaher ba, and a person has to be careful with it. Also not something that we say about every single mitzvah. Obviously, you have to be careful about everything. Why do we have to say that? But why? What's the purpose? What's it all about? 3 words. Kedei lehodia hanes. In order to publicize, in order to mention, in order to declare the miracle. That's what Chanukah is. That's what the candles are about. And now let's think about it, the different elements of lighting candles. Let's go back to source number 1. The Gemara Masechet Shabbat, they told us, what is the mitzvah? Right, Tan Rabbanan, mitzvah Chanukah ner ishu beito. Like we said, nobody does that nowadays. Meaning that's the basic level. It's important to know, because if someone is in extenuating circumstances, there have been a lot of questions by Chayalim over the last couple of years. It's an amazing thing. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Chutz La'aretz, and I was speaking in one of the high schools, and I was telling them, you hear what the Chayalim have to say. You're in war, you're fighting, you're in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, whatever it is. These people are literally putting their lives on the line. They are willing to sacrifice their lives. They're in the situation. Who cares about lighting Chanukah candles? Our Chayalim care. And the questions that come up, and the looking at every possibility that they have in order to, even in that situation, be able to light candles. Obviously, if one's in a place where you're going to light the candles and that's going to show the enemy where you are and it's going to put you in danger, so of course you'd be exempt from that. But nonetheless, there are all sorts of creative ideas and suggestions that our Chayalim came up with, and that's maybe for another time. But the point is, the mitzvah is ner ishu beito. So every night of Chanukah, if I light one candle, even on the 8th night, if I've just lit one candle, I have fulfilled the mitzvah on a basic level. So maybe I'm saying, under extenuating circumstances, a soldier, if all he's able to do is light one candle, he certainly fulfilled the mitzvah. But nonetheless, we're not satisfied with that. We try and go for the greater level of hidur. So the Gemara says, "Amahadrin ner lekol ve'echad ve'echad." Those who want to be mehudar, those who want to have a higher level of observance, there's a candle for everybody, meaning every member of the household will light a candle. And then it says, "Amahadrin min amahadrin," but there is an even greater level than that. Beit Shammai omrim yom rishon madlik shmone mikan ve'elech pochet v'olech. Beit Shammai says on the first night you light 8, and each night you light less until you light only 1 on the last night. But Beit Hillel omrim yom rishon madlik echat umikan ve'elach mosif ve'olech. Beit Hillel says on the first night you light 1, the second night you light 2, the third night you light 3, etc., until you get to 8. Okay, now there's a question here, which is, the Gemara gave 3 levels. It said the basic level is that you light 1 candle. The second level is that you light 1 candle for every member of the household. The third level is you change how many candles you light each night. You go from 1 to 8. So the question is, that third level, is that building on level number 2? Meaning level number 2 was that everybody in the household lights. So are we saying the greater hidur is that everybody in the household lights a different number of candles each night? Okay, that is, and that's the way the Ashkenazim paskin. Or are we saying that level 3, this Mahadrin min Mahadrin, is rejecting the second level and it's building on the basic level, which means the basic level is 1 candle. A step higher than that is everybody in the household lights, but a step higher in that is never mind everybody in the household, but just 1 member of the household would light a different number of candles each night. And that's how the Sfardim paskin. Okay, but in any event, we say we increase the number of candles. And why do we have to have a different number of candles each night? So that it's recognizable which night it is, so that it's recognizable how long the miracle went on for, so that when people see there's an element here of pirsum hanes. There's an element of reminding. There's an element of declaring, look at what happened. Right? So this idea of pirsum hanes, of publicizing, it's not just that I'm doing something different that I know for myself, but that I'm showing the world. There was one night, there were 2 nights, all the way up to 7 nights, and then 500 answers while we get to 8 nights. Yes?
Shouldn't there actually be 4 levels here? There actually should be. In other words, one person in the family, the father, for example, lights 1 candle. Then it happens that everyone lights 1 candle every night. Shouldn't there be another one which says that the father lights 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the 4th level should be that everyone lights 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So that's exactly the question. So the Gemara says explicitly there's 3 levels, but exactly the Machloket Rishonim and Achronim as a result is what is that 3rd level, what you've just described as level 3 or level 4. That's the difference in how we read the Gemara. It's actually interesting here in that this is one of those cases where the Sephardi Rishonim understand it the way that ultimately the Ramah, the way that the Ashkenazim paskin, and it's the way the Ashkenazi Rishonim learn it is the way that the Sephardim paskin, which is it's unusual. It's one of those strange cases. But in any event, but according to everybody, we changed Mahadran min Mahadran means we changed the number of candles, and it seems to be related to this idea of Pirsumei Nisa. Okay, another expression of this. When do we light candles? So this is something as well which has changed very much since earlier times with the advent of electricity and other things. But the Gemara says in the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, this is not on the sheets in front of you, but in Siman Taf Reish Ayin Bet, which is where the Shulchan Aruch discusses Zman Halakat Ner Chanukah, the time of lighting Chanukah candles. And he says, when do we light? We don't light during the daytime. Okay, there are differences of opinion whether we start lighting at Shkia or start lighting at Seit HaKochavim, but it's at the end of the day, at the beginning of the night. Lo ma'achlim v'lo maktimim, says Shulchan Aruch, not later, not earlier. Now, why do we light then? And the answer is, he quotes here the language from the Gemara, he says, or in the next sif, he says, what happens if a person forgot or wasn't able to light immediately at sunset? Madlik v'olech, Ad shetichle regel min hashuk. The time that you can continue lighting is ad shetichle regel min hashuk, until there are no legs left in the marketplace, literally. Meaning until people have gone home. But I used to live, when we first got married, we lived just quite near Shuk Machanei Yehuda. So everybody used to joke when we go onto Chanukah, you really know when it's ad shetichle regel min hashuk. You can see the people walking. I can tell you that nowadays, the time of when people leave the Shuk is a lot later than it used to be a number of years ago. But the point is, so at the time of the Shulchan Aruch, at the time of the Gemara, what was that time of Ad Shtichle Regel Min Hashuk when people went home? That was half an hour after nightfall. Half an hour after nightfall, there was nobody out. Everybody was inside. Okay? And therefore he says, later than that, you can no longer light your Chanukah candles. Why not? Because nobody will see it. Because it has to be before the time of Shetichle Regel Min Hashuk, so there'll be Pirsumei Nisa. Because we want people to be able to see the candles. If nobody is out, then nobody can see the candles, and you have not fulfilled your mitzvah, right? According to that. The discussion nowadays is that, yes, nowadays people are out much later, right? Certainly more than half an hour after nightfall. And therefore, do we say that this time of Ad Shetichle Regel Min Hashuk extends? Certainly, b'diavad, we would say that the time is later. There are those who want to argue that maybe if people are out much later, so not only does that mean I can light my Chanukah candles later, but means maybe I should have candles that are burning for that entire period. Okay, that's a halachic discussion. Again, be that as it may. But the point is that certainly lekatchila, ideally, the time that we are instructed, the time that we are required to light our candles is the time when people will see them, so that there'll be the maximum element of Pirsumei Nisa, maximum element of publicizing the miracle. So that's in terms of how many we light, in terms of how we light, in terms of when we light, and of course in terms of where we light. Where do we light the Chanukah candles? So the Gemara tells us, you light your candles outside. At a certain stage in history, it was not safe for Jews to light candles outside, for religious observance to take place in a public area. So the Gemara says, so then you take your candles inside. But still, you light them where? You light them by the window. And then it says if you can't light them by the window, if it's a shata sakana, so you just put them on the table inside where nobody can see them, but that is not ideal. One of the great things about that we've returned to Eretz Yisrael, and once again we have in many places, many of the custom again of lighting candles outside. There are those who still prefer to light inside, to light in the windows. And again, as I say, there's a whole halachic literature regarding that argument. But the point is certainly, ideally, we want to light the candles in a place where they can be seen. Okay, so taking everything together, what we've seen is a complete contradiction in terms. On the one hand, we say mitzvat Chanukah ner ish ubeito. It has to be in the home. It has to be in the house. You don't have a house, you can't light. The one place in halacha we know where we light, which is not a house, which is in the Beit Knesset, in the shul. We don't know why, but seemingly that's connected to the fact that for some people that was a house. And even if you light in the shul, you have to go home and you have to light again and say the bracha. On the other hand, Pirsumei Nisa, everything about this mitzvah and everything about the way that we fulfill this mitzvah has to be done in the most public way. So we can ask the question, if Pirsumei Nisa is so important, why didn't Chazal say the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is not mitzvah Ner Ishu Beito? The mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is mitzvah Ner Ish v'Kikaro. Right? Go and light it in the public square. Chabad have got it right. Chabad go and Chabad light candles everywhere, the most public place. By the way, Minhag Chabad is you light candles out in the street, you light candles wherever, you have a big Masibat Chanukah, and they'll say a bracha. Right? Many other poskim argue with that, but the way that Chabad paskin is that you say the bracha. Why? Because of Pirsumei Nisa. But that's exactly the question we're asking. Why doesn't everybody say that? Why shouldn't that be the way it is? So have a look at the Pnei Yoshua, source number 5. Pnei Yoshua here.
Does Chabad then go home and light again?
I think so. Pnei Yoshua, source number 5. He says like this: B'Gemara Tana Rabbanan, mitzvah Chanukah ner ish ubeito nir'eh. He says this mitzvah is very different. This is what we started off with. But this mitzvah is very different from other mitzvot. Shein chovat haguf, that normally it's incumbent upon the individual. Shayach chiyuv al kol yachid v'yachid. Each and every individual has to light their candles. Gemara in Kiddushin says there is a principle in general that a mitzvah is incumbent upon an individual more than to do it by proxy. There are certain mitzvot we can fulfill by proxy, but better, says the Gemara, regarding Kiddushin and regarding Oneg Shabbos, right, that you should do it oneself. Ela deshani hacha. Here it's different. She'en hacha ikal ha-mitzvah Ela b'samuch le'reshut harabim, because here the main mitzvah is only when it is adjacent to the reshut harabim. Again, very interesting. Samuch le'reshut harabim. It's not in the reshut harabim. It's not in the public domain. It's near the public domain. You're already hearing here a bit of a contradiction. Shum mishum pirsumei nisa, because the main element is about publicizing the miracle. Mishum kach yitilu chovat mitzvah zo k'ilu hi chovat habayit. In order that it should be done in a public way, right? If there's a mitzvah that's on each and every individual, so I can do it in my home, I can do it wherever, there's nothing public about that. Yeah, since the mitzvah has to be public, therefore it was placed as an obligation, not on each individual, but on each house. Ve'adayin sarich iyun. Says the Pnei Yoshua, that's my answer, but I'm not satisfied with it. It requires further study. It requires further investigation. Why does he say Adayin Tzarich Iyun? And I think the reason is this. I think the reason he says Adayin Tzarich Iyun is because I'm telling you that the mitzvah is intrinsically related to the public domain, but it has to be done in the private domain. Something here doesn't make sense. Something doesn't add up. If the point is really about Pirsumei Nisa, disconnected from the house entirety. Okay. And if at the moment it's difficult enough to understand, I mentioned there's a historical stage where the mitzvah goes from outside, it goes inside. And in a sense, we lose that element of Pirsumei Nisa, and now everything becomes even more complicated. Okay, have a look. Yes?
If we took away the issue of lighting inside of one's private domain,
yeah,
okay, and we stress the public, one's own family might lose out seeing it. If there's an invalid in the home, or the wife is at home, etc. So you really need both of them in order to get Pirsumei Nisa Klalit.
Okay, very good, excellent. So you're raising a very, very, very important point, which is when we say Pirsumei Nisa, we're publicizing the miracle Who are we publicizing to? We're publicizing to the outside world. We're publicizing to our own family. We're publicizing to both. That's exactly at the heart of the discussion. We're going to get to that in a moment. So have a look, source number 4, the Beit Yosef that we saw already, when he started off talking about why it is that we light candles inside the shul. Right? So we brought one explanation, which is that the shul is, in a sense, people's home for those guests who are coming and they were eating and sleeping inside, adjacent to the shul, and that's why we started lighting there. But here the Beit Yosef brings now, in the second line, after the 3 dots, those 3 dots are not in the original Beit Yosef, it's just I didn't bring the entire language. But he brings here a tshuva from one of the Rishonim, the Rivash. And the Rivash says something which is going to help us tie everything together. The Rivash says in his response as follows. He says, "Minhag hazeh ladlik beveit hakneset, minhag vatik inhu." Again, as I said, we're not sure when and how exactly this minhag began, and there were those who were opposed to it. So first of all, he's defending it. He's saying this is a proper minhag. It's correct that we light inside the shul. And why do we do it? Mishum pirsumei nisa. Okay, because of publicizing the miracle. Now listen to what he says. He says, in our days, we cannot fulfill the mitzvah in the proper way. To light, everybody should light outside. He's now talking in this time period where we lost that ability to do because it was dangerous. That the nations of the world will have what to say about us, and worse. So since we can't light outside anymore, we've lost the element of Pisumei Nisa. So we're still fulfilling the mitzvah of Ner Ishu Beito, okay, but we've disconnected this idea of Pisumei Nisa from it. And therefore, in order to make up for that Pisumei Nisa, we light it therefore in the shul. That's essentially what he says. Now, how can you say a bracha? He says you can say a bracha because it's a minhag, the same way in Halal and Rosh Chodesh is a minhag, and we can say a bracha, etc. But in other words, it says there are two different elements, 2 different parts of this mitzvah that we have to separate. And this is really the question. Once I lose the ability to light the candles outside, as I've said, in our days, we've regained that ability. And some say we should go back to that, and some say we should still light inside the window. Okay. But when I lose that ability of that, the question is what happens to that element of Pirsumei Nisa, of publicizing the miracle? So the Rivash says the Pirsumei Nisa is gone. He would not accept your point, seemingly, that you have to publicize it to your family within the home. He says you're publicizing to the outside world. That's why it's related to Reshut Harabim. When I can't do that anymore, so I still fulfill the mitzvah as I can, but there's no Pirsum, and I have to achieve that Pirsum somewhere else, and that is in the Beit Knesset.
Why is not made up in shul, as he said?
Why is what?
Why is it not made up for in shul when it's not just a family? It's 100 people.
So he's saying the Pirsum Nes is made up for, but the basic mitzvah, and that's what we started off the beginning of the share, was Ner Ishu Beito, which is the mitzvahs related to the household, to the home. If I light a candle in a place that is not my home, I've not fulfilled my mitzvah. And that's exactly the question we're asking. Why not? Why not? So what happens here to this element of Pirsumei Nisa? Rivash says the Pirsumei Nisa is gone when you light the candle inside. Now, it's very interesting. There are other poskim, and again, this is going to sound like a contradiction, but what I want to do is take these 2 opinions and bring them together and show you they don't actually contradict, but they complement. There are other poskim who say, no, Pirsumei Nisa still exists. Pirsumei Nisa exists within the home. No longer do we say that I'm publicizing the miracle to the outside world, but I'm publicizing it to my family, to the people that are inside. Where do you see an example of this in halakha? So, the Shulchan Aruch, which I mentioned to you earlier, about what happens if a person missed the time, for whatever reason, you were unable to light your candles in the first half an hour after nightfall. Okay, and it's later on in the night. So the Shulchan Aruch says like this. He talks about the time when we have to light. He says that is lekatchila. Aval im aval ze azman v'lo idlik. That time passed and you had not lit your candles. Madlik v'olech kol halayla. You could light the entire night. And then if the whole night passed and you didn't light, you don't have tashlumin. It's not like if you miss a tefillah and you can make it up with tefillah tashlumin the next time. That Chanukah candles doesn't work that way. But says the Mishnah Berurah, hang on a second. He says you could light the entire night. So he says with the bracha, you could say the bracha 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. You could say the bracha, but on one condition. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu dafka im bnei abayit ne'orim. That means that if there are people in your home and they are awake and they will see the candles, so then I still have this element of Pirsum Hanes. There's a discussion here. What do you do if everybody in your house is sleeping? Are you allowed to go and wake them up so that they can see the candles? Generally not recommended. Okay? But
What if you know that during the night people get up and they wander around, they go to the bathroom, whatever? Is that good enough?
okay, if the point is, what he's saying is, if people are going to see it, then you have achieved that element of Pirsum Hanes, and therefore that would be okay. Now, according to the Rivash, we might say, according to the Rivash, who said that Pirsum Hanes is gone, and now we just have the element of lighting the candles, and Pirsum Hanes takes place in the Beit Knesset. He might say, okay, you can light the candles whatever time. If no one's going to see it, it doesn't matter because there's no Pirsum Hanes. But according to this opinion, we're saying, no, somebody still has to see it, but it's still the people that are inside that are going to see. So what I think we can say, how we can tie all of this together, is the following. First of all, Pirsum Hanes maybe is not what we originally thought it was. We started off, we thought Pirsum Hanes, it's all about advertising, it's all about going as loud as we can, as far and as wide as we can, publicizing the miracle to the entire world. What we see from here is that there is an element, and maybe there's even a stronger element of publicizing, not when it's out to the entire world, but it's inside and it's within the home itself. And that can start to help us to understand the tzarich iyun of the Pnei Yoshua. Because if the point was to advertise as far as wide as we can, go light your candles in the Kikar, go light your candles in Times Square and Trafalgar Square and all these places, right, which we do nowadays. But the point is, why the home, right? Outside the home is related to Reshut Rabim, but it's not, it's the Pirsum. If we're honest with ourselves, how far and wide is it going to go? Not that far. But we see there's another place. There is another mitzvah that has this element of Pirsum Hanes, and it's also a mitzvah that's done precisely within the home, and it's going to teach us the same thing. Have a look at the Rambam. The Rambam, this is a well-known Rambam at the end of Hilchot Chanukah. He says like this, we saw the beginning already. He says, right, the mitzvah is kedei leodia hanes, leosif v'sheva chayil v'odaya lo al hanisim sh'asa lanu. Afilu ein lo ma yochal. Lo aleinu, if a person is very, very poor and is destitute, they can't even afford to buy food. Lo ein lo ma yochal ela minat tzedakah. Shoel o mocher ksuto v'lokeach shemen v'neirot umadlik. He has to sell the clothes off his back in order to buy a candle to be able to fulfill this mitzvah. That's quite radical. Again, we don't say that by many mitzvot. Says the Rambam, this is how far we go. And he continues. He says, what if a person only has a very, very small amount of money? And the option is he has enough money, he can buy wine for Kiddush, for Shabbat, or he can buy a candle. Not mahadrim and mahadrim, just one candle. But he can buy a candle for Ner Chanukah. Which one takes precedence? Makdim leknot shemen. He says the mitzvah of Chanukah takes precedence over Kiddush. Since both of these are rabbinic mitzvot, and therefore the Chanukah, which has a remembrance of here he says Zichron Hanes, okay, but it's a quite similar concept to Pirsum Hanes. Now in the next halacha, he says, Ner Beitov and Ner Chanukah, or Ner Beitov and Kiddush Hayom. What if now he has a choice between he has one candle, so he could use it for a Shabbat candle, or he could use it for a Chanukah candle. Right, which one comes first? So there he says the candle of Shabbat comes first because of Shalom Bayit. Okay, but let's go back. Right, so we saw Ner Chanukah still takes precedence over Kiddush, and Ner Chanukah, one is obligated to the extent that one has to sell the clothes off one's back in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Where does he get that from? How does the Rambam know? What's his source for the fact that you have to fulfill mitzvah Ner Chanukah even if you can't afford it? Right? Most mitzvot, we won't say you have to, if you truly can't afford, you would have to fulfill. So the Maggid Mishnah over here says the following. He says the Gemara doesn't tell me this, but the Gemara tells me this idea somewhere else. It says it by Pesach. It says it by Leil HaSeder. It says that afilu ani shebiYisrael lo yifchot me'arba kosot. Right? Even the poorest person, the community has an obligation to make sure that they have wine, that they're able to fulfill the 4 cups of wine. And why is that? Says the Maggid Mishnah that there it's because of Mishum Pirsumei Nisa, in order to publicize the miracle. And in the same way that we have this idea of Pirsumei Nisa by the 4 cups of wine, we know that we have this idea of Pirsumei Nisa by Ner Chanukah, and therefore even the Ani is obligated to fulfill it. Now I really don't understand. Okay, Ner Chanukah, we said Pirsumei Nisa, you're publicizing. What do you mean you're publicizing? It's outside your home. At least it's outside. Right, the 4 cups of wine, what's Pirsumei Nisa? Nobody knows that I'm drinking 4 cups of wine. Nobody knows that I'm having a Seder. The only people that know are my family that are sitting with me around the table. And maybe that's exactly the point, that is greater in a sense. The greatest Pirsumei Nisa is that we are passing it on. We are passing on that story and passing on, publicizing that miracle from generation to generation within the family. That comes first. Meaning, if I have a choice that I can publicize this outside to the entire world, or I can publicize it within the home, so that's what comes first. Right? You know, they say today, you think about what's happened, and you think about this in the context of the situation we find ourselves, what's happened over the last 2 years, and the Jewish people's story. You know, they say that Israel has a Hasbara problem. That might be true, but I think it goes deeper than that. Because you look at what's happened, and you look at what we've done, and you look at what our enemies have done, and you know, sometimes you just want to bang your head against the wall, and you want to say, what do they have to do for the world to realize, you know, who is right and who is wrong, and where justice is, and what's going on? I don't think it's just the fact that we don't invest enough money in TikTok. I think there's something more than that. And the idea is, you know, we can stand and we can shout out loud and we can scream from the rooftops, but first and foremost, we have to scream inside. We have to publicize within the home. Pirsumei Nisa, it's all about Ner Ishu Beito. Publicize it to ourselves, tell our own people, tell our own story, make sure that we understand, make sure that we internalize. And that is the way that it continues, that we ensure that it is eternal, that is the way that we ensure that it continues. So why, if that's the case? Why, if that's the case, all of this is b'diavad. All of this is nowadays that we've lost, for what the Rivash is saying, that we've lost the ability to go outside. Why did they say that the Pirsumei Nisa needs to be outside when we can? So here's, I think, this is the crux of the matter. We want Pirsumei Nisa outside, if we can. If we can publicize it to the outside world as well, we want it to be, but it needs to be connected to the home. Because actually what we are publicizing is the existence of the home, and it's the sanctity that exists within, and it's, you know, lighting the candles, disconnecting completely from the home. You may be advertising far and wide, but what are you advertising? You've lost the essence of what the miracle is. Let's remember how Chanukah started. Let's remember how this battle began. Look at the Mishnah Berurah in source number 7. Right, there's a siman in Shulchan Aruch that tells us that women are also obligated in lighting candles, even though it is a positive time-bound mitzvah, which normally women are exempt from, because we have a principle, af hein hayu b'oto hanes, that they were also involved in the miracle. What does that mean, they were also involved in the miracle? It could mean one of two things. It could mean that they were also threatened, and the miracle came to save them. It can also mean that the miracle was brought about by them. Okay, and the Mishnah Berurah gives both. But one of the things he says, the very beginning, how this whole story began, one of the things that led to the uprising against the Yevanim, שהנס היה גם להן, שהגזירה הייתה על כל בתולה הנישאת שתיבעל להגמון תחילה. Right? The enemy came along and they said, we are going to completely dismantle and uproot and disregard the sanctity of the family, the sanctity that exists within the Jewish home. We are going to tear that apart. That's something they couldn't stand. And it's something you may have noticed in the modern world in different ways, sometimes in more subtle ways, sometimes in less subtle ways. That is something that is being attacked, and that's something that is being challenged. It's something that's been attacked in the most vicious ways in this war as well. And the Tzitz Eliezer says this, I haven't brought it for you on the source sheet, but the Tzitz Eliezer, in one of his drashot for Chanukah, he says the unique family character of OUisrael is the secret to our existence. And thus the Greeks threw their full weight in trying to annul it. When the Chashmonaim overcame, they established that in every Jewish home the candles would be lit to symbolize the restoration of that former glory, the consolidation and the unity of the Jewish family unit. In other words, the miracle that we are publicizing at the end of the day, it's not the visibility of that candle, but it's the existence of the home from within it can be lit as well. That's what we're celebrating, that's what we're publicizing, that's what we're showing, and that's what we are demonstrating and shouting to the whole world, first and foremost to ourselves, but further out as well.
that statement that you said first and foremost for ourselves is really true as well, because the Arba Kasod would be required as Pisumenes if there's no other family member. And if a person's alone at home, he will light the candles, and that's Pisumenes of within.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Actually, yes, you were first, please.
We have a situation that may be different from anybody else's here, because from our living room window where we put the candles, the only people who can see it are people in the next neighborhood just down the hill, and they are all Arabs. Are we declaring this miracle to the Jewish people or to the world, even to our enemies?
So that's what I say. I think that there's an element here of both. I think that there is precisely an element of both. But the point is that we cannot disconnect that from the home. It has to come from within, and that light that shines. Essentially, that's what the Rambam is telling us as well, right? The Rambam at the end, when he says, if you have the choice between Ner Chanukah and Ner Shabbat, you only have one candle. Remember, Rambam said Ner Chanukah takes precedence even over Kiddush Hayom. But if you only have one candle, and you can light it either for a Chanukah candle or you can light it for a Shabbat candle. So what do you light? He says you light the Shabbat candle first because you have Shalom Bayit. If I don't have Shalom Bayit, then the Pirsum Manes is going to be meaningless. But ultimately, we want to have both of them. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to build on what the gentleman said right now, and that is that if someone has a Seder on his own, he's still chayiv for the Daled Kossos, and there is involved over here, Pitum Nisa. Therefore, l'chora with Nerot Chanukah, if the person is home alone, there can still be an element of Pisumei Netza with one person, with he himself. He can sit, he can contemplate the things, he can meditate, whatever the case may be, but there is Pisumei Netza even with one.
Yes. So I agree. Again, these points there are halachic debates and there are arguments about all of these points and these kind of cases, and that's not our purpose to get into today. But the idea certainly exists. The idea is correct that even if it's me by myself, there's an element here of that pirsum. Let me just leave you with one idea. Which is this. So I mentioned the question at the beginning of why do we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days if the miracle only took place for 7 days? And as I've said, there are literally hundreds of answers and different ideas to this. But maybe based on all that we've said, we can suggest there's one very, very beautiful answer, which is this. We talk about Pirsum Hanes. We talk about publicizing, and the Gemara says that at a certain point we couldn't publicize it outside anymore. There's a Shata Sakana. We bring the candle inside. If you think of the sum total of Jewish history, you think how often was it? The fact that today we can go and we can light those candles outside is a miracle. It was something we weren't able to do for many, many generations. But the truth is that for most of Jewish history and for most of the fulfillment of this mitzvah, it was done in private. It was done in secret. It was only those within the home who could do it. And there's been a lot of times and there's been a lot of room for despair if we didn't know better and we didn't know about the bigger picture. But we've been able to, those lights, those tiny, tiny candles show us first and foremost, however dark things may seem, there's always going to be a way forward. Hashem is always with us. Maybe that's the idea of why this idea of Chavivut Hanes, that it is so precious. The candles, it's not just the candles that are precious, but it's we that are precious to Hashem, and that is something that we remember in that miracle, and that is something that represents. I heard an idea once that says, why do we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days and not just 7? It says 7 days was the fact that the oil kept burning. But the 8th day, or the first day, depending whichever way you look at it, is the fact that they even bothered to look. The fact that everything was destroyed, everything was defiled. Who said that we're going to find anything? You could have just given up. And so many times in our history, we could have just given up, and we could have raised our hands, and we could have said, what hope is there? But the fact is, the Jewish people always knew that there was hope. The Jewish people always know to find hope in the most hopeless and the most darkest of circumstances. And that is something that can encourage us. That is something that can give us, certainly, can give us much light for the future. Our situation today is far, far better than it has been many, many, many times throughout our history. And it will only, Be'ezrat Hashem, we hope and we pray that it will only go and get better from here.